Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Fred. Good morning, Leon. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I can't say I'm happy, but I'm always pleased to see my colleagues, especially those who are doing such amazing work on Ukraine, for this event on the 2-year, or today, 2-year and 2-day anniversary of Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. With me, I have Dr. Leon Aron, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I know he's well known to everybody who's watching for his fantastic work on Russia, his very important book on Putin, and Dr. Frederick Kagan, who is both the director of our Critical Threats Project and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. What we're going to do here today is I will open up to Q&A if you want to put your questions through on using our chat function. I think that's the way we're doing it today. If not, I will update everybody. But first, what we'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the state of play vis-a-vis Ukraine, the war that's going on, U.S. policy, what's happening in Russia, especially in the wake of the Navalny murder, and go from there. Fred, perhaps I can get you to start and just update everybody a little bit on what the state of the battle is right now.
Well, thanks, Danny. Thanks for arranging this. War's not over. The active combat is underway. The Russians have taken the initiative across the theater and are conducting offensive operations pretty much across the theater, particularly in northeastern Ukraine. Obviously, just took the town of Avdiivka. I'll come back to that in a second. But they're launching offensive operations elsewhere, including trying to retake the territory that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 had taken. And the Russians are leaning into this effort, and they are making progress. The Ukrainians are hard pressed. The delays in the provision of U.S. Military assistance have seriously handicapped the Ukrainian defenders. Among other things, they've forced the Ukrainians to go entirely over to the defensive, which is a problem because it means that basically the Russians can choose where they want to attack and how much they want to attack and when they feel like stopping. And the Ukrainians are not able to really set the terms of any of these battles, but have to take it as the Russians come. That's not a good place to be when you're on the receiving end of a lot of attacks. The situation can become very serious if the U.S. does not provide the military assistance that we have been talking about providing for more than 6 months now. Our European allies and our Asian allies and partners are really stepping up. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we need to keep in mind that the United States has the largest and most powerful military among all of our allies. And we are the only ones who actually have the stocks and the stockpiles of equipment that can be delivered to Ukraine rapidly in order to affect the outcome of fighting this year. And I want to start by talking about the alarming part, because I think that there's a lot of complacency. And I think that a lot of people are seeing what they're calling a stalemate. It isn't actually a stalemate, but a lot of people are seeing what they're calling a stalemate and imagining that that'll just persist regardless of whether the U.S. gives more assistance or not. That's not the case. If U.S. doesn't provide military assistance soon, we are going to start to see the Russians make significant gains. And that's going to put a huge amount of pressure on the Ukrainians. If we don't provide any more assistance at all, it's very possible that you will end up seeing the front lines start to move very rapidly toward the West by the end of this year. And that should be alarming to us for a lot of reasons that transcend Ukraine, which I'll talk about at the end. So we need to understand the stakes of this discussion are not whether the U.S. continues to contribute to the situation that's going to be relatively stable anyway. or not. The question at hand is the US going to take an inaction as a result of which we could very well see Russian forces driving toward the West and driving through Ukrainian defenders who simply don't have the materiel to stop them from pushing on critical Ukrainian cities and also driving toward the NATO border. So this is a very, very important moment, and it's important that we understand what's at stake. It's also important, though, that we don't accept one of the many Russian information operations that's now circulating, which is that the Russians have already won and the Ukrainians have already lost, and it's over. And that the Russian gains have been significant, and they demonstrate that the Russians can drive over the Ukrainians whether we support them or not. That is not true. So the Russians have taken the town of Avdiivka. Avdiivka had a pre-war population of about 30-something thousand. It sits right up against the pre-2022 lines. The Russians have been trying to take Avdiivka since 2014. They finally managed to do that. They did it at the cost of at least about 16,000 Russian dead. That's more dead than the Russians lost in the entire Soviet-Afghan war to make an advance, according to Russians, of about 10 kilometers. This is not a dramatic breakthrough. This is not something which is unhinging the Ukrainian lines. This is not, frankly, a gain that is worth the price the Russians have paid for it, except informationally. That's true elsewhere along the line as well. The Russians are spending enormous amounts of their own blood and lesser, but still very precious amounts of Ukrainian blood to make very limited gains right now. If we continue to help support the Ukrainians will be able to blunt these offensives as they have blunted them before. If we support them properly, they will be able to launch new counteroffensives that actually could allow them to liberate strategically critical areas and people. Both of those are important. The front line as it is now should not be acceptable to us or the Ukrainians, because it is very advantageous for the Russians as a jumping off point for a future invasion. And there is ground that the Ukrainians really do need to retake if there's going to be a meaningful prospect of deterring a future Russian attack. And there will be a future Russian attack. Leon can talk about this more, but the determination, not just by Putin, but by the people around Putin, to complete the reconquest of Ukraine anyway, and to go beyond that and complete, I think, the reconquest of the Russian Empire, is deep and strong and driving and will continue. I want to say it's also important that we understand that the Ukrainians are not just sitting there being recipients of our assistance and expecting us to continue to dole out huge amounts of assistance forever. Ukraine used to be a major arms exporter. It has a significant arms military industry. The Ukrainians are investing heavily in their own defense industrial base, and they're producing their own material of war. They're also integrating their defense industrial base with European states, with our allies, with our Asian partners, and they're engaging in a lot of joint production agreements, and things are starting to roll off of assembly lines. And they're getting a lot of investment. Our allies and partners are understanding the need not only to support Ukraine, but to expand their own militaries and to expand their own defense industrial bases. And so there is an effort, a very large-scale effort underway to create conditions that would significantly reduce the requirement that Ukraine would have for ongoing massive amounts of American military support. We need to help Ukraine bridge the gap between now and when that requirement will begin to be reduced significantly. That is a couple of more years of significant US military assistance, but it's not forever assistance. There is a point at which Ukraine will very likely be able to reduce significantly the amount of US military assistance that it needs and requires without losing the war. and without sacrificing its own interests and without having us suffer a terrible defeat. And I'll end on this and hand over to Leon. Look, we Americans have gotten, I'm just going to say we've come unmoored from some realities. And one reality that we need to face is that most of the time, wars have winners and losers. And the winners and losers are determined on the battlefield. Most of the time, whoever achieves their objectives by force dictates the peace that follows in the negotiations. It's an aberration in international relations, things like what happened in the Balkans when we intervened militarily and brought the parties together and got them to negotiate the situation that is holding, although with a lot of Western military forces for a long time, mind you. That's unusual. Most wars end because one side wins on the battlefield, the other side loses on the battlefield, and the negotiation ratifies that outcome. So our choices are not whether to negotiate or not, because Putin isn't interested in negotiating, except a negotiation that ratifies the Russian reconquest of Ukraine as a stepping stone to Putin's further objectives of destroying NATO, reducing the United States to what he regards as our proper role as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, and reestablishing Russia in the Soviet Union's place as a global dominant state whose voice is dominant in international affairs. That is the project of which the invasion of Ukraine is a part. And that project will continue once he has absorbed Ukraine, if we are so foolish as to allow him to do so. And so at the end of the day, what we need to understand is this isn't primarily about helping Ukraine. This is about helping defeat Putin so that he doesn't defeat us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I want to correct myself. As usual, I started out with misinformation. Folks, if you do have questions, please email them. It should be on your screen. I just can't see your screen, to Clara.Keuss. That's Clara.Keuss, Keuss, at aei.org. And now, Leon, I think Fred set you up perfectly. There has become a lamentable habit in Washington to talk about this war that's taking place as if somehow it is a war between that involves only us, right? It only involves the United States, NATO, and Ukraine, and we don't talk a lot about Russia. And yet we should. The Zelensky announced this weekend that they had lost 31,000 soldiers in this war thus far. The Russians have lost an order of magnitude probably of 10 times that number, up to 300,000 soldiers. Putin obviously killed his most potent political opponent. We've got elections coming up in Russia in a couple of weeks that no one is paying any attention to, as if somehow what's happening in Russia is completely irrelevant to all of this. Straighten us out.
Danny, I think thank you first of all for arranging this. Thanks, Fred, for saying at least half of what I was going to say. But let me just put a few finishing touches on this. First of all, we have to remember that Ukraine is an existential threat to the Putin regime. It is a brotherly, that's Putin's term, brotherly people who negates existentially the very foundation of the Putin regime. It's Western oriented. It's call it struggling democracy, proto-democracy, and it shows that you could achieve as a Slavic people, you could find a separate way to integrate into the world rather than through domination and aggression. And on another point that Fred made so well, I think we're facing here, Danny, the perennial disjoint between democracies and ideological dictatorships. Democracies want peace, dictatorships want victory. They need victory. Incidentally, this is what, as you well know, this is what Israel confronts in the Middle East. Democracies will do anything for peace. They're enemies of this kind, ideological enemies. That is, the enemies that are driven not so much by territory or so much by acquiring some geopolitical assets, but by ideology. So unfortunately, much to disappointment of some of us, during this past year, Putin has managed to keep up social peace while expending an estimated $300 million a day on the war, and losing, again, according to an estimate that I trust, about 50,000 troops every 6 months killed or injured. Now, we can talk about how he achieved this. But first, let me tell you, this level of, and Alfred, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the information is rather correct. This level of attrition, or about 37%, has not hurt, I mean, minus, of course, with the exception of what Stalin did in World War II, which was about 60% attrition, is the level of attrition of World War I. And of course, this is what actually slightly even higher than World War I, if you took at the British troops in World War I. And so this brings us to what Fred was talking about. It's a war of attrition. And the question is, how long Putin can keep this social peace? This is what we need to know. In adding to Fred's battleground assessment, that is not over. I would like to emphasize, this is not over for Russia either. We need to be patient, and we need to keep Ukraine fighting with all those things that are needed that Fred mentioned. Putin still has about $130 billion in the so-called National Welfare Fund. That's sort of like the rainy day, last resort piggy bank. He can go there. He already went there. He's gone there, scooped about 1/5. He's helped by the sanction evasions that are enabled by China, India, our NATO member Turkey, and it's done through primarily Central Asian states and Armenia, and it's smuggled all those things that Putin needs for war and peace are smuggled through those borders. He will do anything to continue this war. Let me say, at least this year, and I agree, there's not going to be a ceasefire for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that Putin is hoping for a better deal at the end of this year. Why? Because there's Donald Trump, and because, as Fred pointed out, Putin hopes that the West continues to dither with the aid, and he would make significant advances on the battlefront. Domestic opposition, as you pointed out, is in a state of disarray. I call it the North Koreaization of Russia, which is proceeding apace with the judicial murder, of course, of Alexei Navalny. But also, I mean, you could get 9 years, and people have 9 years in jail for affixing a tiny pro-peace sign to the price tag in a grocery store. You could get 7 years in jail for reposting an anti-war post or writing in the snow, "I'm against the war." So far, the repression, the propaganda, the cynicism that Putin has bred over 20 years of his rule, very, very intensely, and of course the poison that he systematically poured into the veins of Russian national consciousness, the greatness equivalent to aggression, fear is equivalent to how Russia should behave. We are exclusive. The West is surrounding us. The West is always plotting. All of those things so far have held social peace for him. I don't think there's going to be much change in the coming year. But let me mention at the end one more thing. The sanctions are not a bomb. They don't kill and they don't destroy immediately. But they are like a very heavy lead foot that sits on the two oxygen hoses that sustain the Putin regime. One is the oil money, and the other is brings the stuff that is sanctioned but still gets in. No, they did not close it, and I don't think they're going to completely block those oxygen lines, but they're slowly and surely degrading the Russian society and the Russian military. The inflation officially is 7.5%, but some Russian economists pointed out that things like bread, eggs, daily necessities are up 23%. This is not good. And finally, we are going on to the fourth year of the war next year. And what that means is 1917. How long when we talk about domestic dissent and domestic stability, we forget that, yes, it's true that since the Decembrist rebellion, 2 centuries ago, the Russian army generally has not involved itself into politics. But 4 years of this war of attrition, of this absolutely pointless, and it will be pointless if, as Fred pointed out, the West does its job. How long before, to quote, the 1917 slogan, they will turn their bayonets on Moscow and St. Petersburg? Yevgeny Prigozhin tried this summer. It was half-hearted. It was not planned. But how long will the generals, and usually it's the mid-level officers who are there with soldiers, seeing them killed for nothing, for the war of attrition that is not progressing? How long before they begin to rebel?
Leon, I want to just follow up with you. And now that you have both given sort of what Congress might call opening statements, although I think very expansive, maybe we can just bounce around a little bit quickly before we turn to our audience questions, which are super interesting. Leon, what I don't get, especially given everything you've laid out, is that yes, of course, Putin is turning Russia into a police state, a truly police state with all the modern technology that helps him. Why is it that we appear to have no strategy to weaken him at all? I don't understand that. This is a vulnerability for him. The loss of life, the loss of economic supremacy. Why is it that both Europe and the United States seem to have no strategy to weaken him in any serious way?
Well, Danny, these are peculiar regimes. We haven't been able to do anything about North Korea or Cuba for quite a while. And this is an oil-producing state. Well, as you pointed out, we can't shut off, even if we could, we can't shut off the flow of oil from Russia because democracies don't want $200 a barrel oil. We cannot somehow start agitating the Russian people, even though we know that there are movements of the wives and mothers of the reservists who were mobilized a year and a half ago, and who essentially are told, you're either killed or we'll win this war. There's no rotation and there's no return for you. That will continue to grow. The sanctions will continue to degrade Russia. I don't think we can count on anything very quick and very effective from the outside. Sorry.
I disagree with you. I think there are things we definitely can do. We can seize Russia's foreign exchange reserves outside of Russia. That's $300 billion.
Of course. The stuff that was frozen. Yes,
Yep.
absolutely.
And we could start sanctioning Russian oil exports. And you're totally right about the political considerations behind that. But that's our political considerations, right? Not about victory in the war. So I think we could do more, but we're not. Fred, I want to turn back to you quickly. Leon called this a war of attrition. Uh, I think that's I'm not sure that that's how the Ukrainians see it. Can you talk a little bit about the conduct of the war from that perspective and add in whatever it is that you would like?
Sure. There's lots of attrition going on in this war, and without getting too technical, there are different kinds of wars that you can talk about. Um, And attrition refers to it refers to defining a kind of war based on the mechanism of victory. If you think that you are going to kill your way to victory, then you're engaged in an attritional war. And then the purpose is just to kill enough of the enemy to make the enemy surrender or lose or whatever. But you have to usually prevent the enemy from killing too many of your guys. And so then you're in attritional gradients and that sort of thing. And a lot of people are talking about this war that way. But that's not actually what's going on. The Russians are not trying to kill their way to victory in this war. They're actually trying to gain ground. And the problem that they have is that the war has become positional, and positional warfare is a different kind of war. It's a kind of war in which the front lines don't move very much. Neither side is able really to make a breakthrough and exploit it. Because breakthrough exploitation, that's what we would call maneuver war. That's how this war began. And the Ukrainians have been able to do that to the Russians a couple of times in Kherson and Kharkiv and so forth. The object in positional war usually is to find a way to restore maneuver to the battlefield. And this is a feasible undertaking. And this is, if people forget, World War I ended as a war of maneuver. In 1918, what you saw was first the Germans and then the Allies beginning to drive scores of miles in either direction as the war regained the maneuver war characteristics because it had been in a positional state. So it matters because, yes, there's a lot of attrition, of course. There's attrition in any kind of war. It's particularly notable in positional warfare, but that's not the mechanism of defeat. The Ukrainians don't think that they're going to kill so many Russians that the Russians are going to surrender. The Russians aren't trying to kill their way out of this either. Both sides are trying to restore maneuver to the battlefield. This is why US aid is so important, because the US could provide Ukraine with the systems that will help Ukraine restore maneuver to the battlefield for Ukraine. On the other hand, if we withhold assistance and we don't give Ukraine any more military assistance, then unfortunately we're looking at a scenario where the Russians may very well restore maneuver to the battlefield. And at that point, again, you're going to start to see the lines move to the west much more rapidly in a way that should really alarm us.
I'm going to sprinkle in some of the questions that I'm seeing from our audience as well, because I think it fits well into the flow of our conversation. Fred, one of the concerns that's been raised by people about Ukraine and about foreign assistance to Ukraine is this corruption issue. Now, I realize that in some ways it's become a trope to oppose assistance, and I get that. But at the same time, I think Ukraine was infamous, right, historically, even post-Soviet Union, for the levels of corruption in the government. Now, there was a reshuffle in the government. Recently, some of that might have been due to this question as well. Talk about that issue and Ukraine.
So just to begin with, one of the things that is always sort of interesting is we spend a huge amount of time talking about Ukrainian corruption because we're giving Ukraine stuff and secondarily money. And so we're worried about our stuff and money being misappropriated, which is a reasonable concern. We never talk about Russian corruption, which is hysterical because Russia is a kleptocracy by design. And Russian corruption would be even more legendary, except one doesn't talk about it. And one doesn't talk about it for various reasons, including those that Leon has identified. This is relevant. Why are we so cognizant of Ukrainian corruption? Because Ukrainians talk about it all the time. Because especially after throwing out the Russian dictator Yanukovych in 2014, Ukrainians invested in building a very robust civil society with a lot of NGOs and a very robust free press that made it its business to report out on Ukrainian corruption. And recently, particularly after this war began, but even before then, President Zelensky has been focusing on getting Ukrainian corruption under control. We continue to hear about Ukrainian corruption because Ukrainian civil society reports it out, and because the Ukrainian judicial system finds instances of corruption and prosecutes them. So a certain other think tank in town, which I won't name, made a big deal about a recent corruption case in which Ukrainian funds allocated for the Ukrainian war effort were misappropriated. And it presented that as evidence that Ukraine is so corrupt that we shouldn't provide it with any more assistance. The fascinating thing is that the reason we know about that is because the Ukrainian judiciary caught these guys and got the money back. It was a successful anti-corruption measure, anti-corruption effort that was being portrayed as evidence that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. Opposite of the truth. Look, there is always, all post-Soviet states have problems with corruption because the Soviet Union was deeply corrupt and it corrupted all of its member states. So again, the Russians are the root cause of this corruption. But Ukraine has had this problem. Ukraine has also been cognizant of it, and Ukraine is dealing with it very aggressively. And what we're seeing is, in addition to that, the Ukrainians are cooperating very closely with the Department of Defense and other US agencies to ensure that there's incredible transparency about how the aid is going and how it's being used. And to me, the thing that is most reassuring about all of this is, look, especially when we're focusing on the weapon systems and the ammunition and stuff we're providing the Ukrainians, if that stuff were not getting to the front line, there would be Ukrainian journalists all over that story. But on the contrary, we're seeing that stuff used on the front line all the time. We've got the video, we're tracking this, we're seeing the Russians are talking about how the Ukrainians are using this stuff. We know that the aid that we're providing is getting to the Ukrainian soldiers. And that's the thing that matters most.
Leon, one of the things that interests me, when I piqued my interest when Fred talked about corruption in Russia as well, I wonder, if you can just talk about whether, if Putin were gone, there would be a different state of affairs in Russia, or is there a phalanx of, when the Communist Party was in charge, we knew, right? You'd have Communist A, then you'd have Communist B, then you'd have Communist C. What does the future in Russia look like if Putin is gone?
Danny, it's a fascinating lecture of its own, but three factors. First, in Russian history, and I assume in other countries' histories, there's a pendulum. Usually after a brutal dictatorship and aggressive dictatorship, there's some what we might call peaceable liberalization. In the Russian case, it was what happened after Ivan the Terrible. It what happened after Peter the Great. It happened, of course, after Paul. First, it happened after the classic reactionary Nicholas I, Fred's favorite, and of course, the pendulum, and of course, most spectacularly, Khrushchev after Stalin. The pendulum swings even wider. The amplitude is even wider in case of a military defeat. And again, what we might call the First Crimea War, the defeat there in the mid-19th century led to Alexander II, true liberal revolution from above. Afghanistan was a factor in Gorbachev's revolution from above. The defeat in the Russo-Korean War led to the resignation of Nicholas II, and of course the setbacks in World War I to the February Democratic Revolution. That's one thing, but there are two sort of rubs, institutional rubs. The first one is that the closest to us, Stalin's death, is that apart from the NKVD, MGB repressive apparatus, which was the most powerful institution, there were other institutions that were maybe not as strong, but they were independent. And the Politburo consisted of pretty strong political actors that were independent from the security services. The party, Khrushchev, Malenkov, the government. A bonus question: who is the head of the Russian government today? Who is the prime minister? Okay, spoilers alert. Mikhail Mishustin, who is the head of the ruling party. Again, you're right. It's Dmitry Medvedev and Viktor Turchak. So as the FSB dominance here, paradoxically, its penetration and domination and rule of every institution in the Russian society, strangely enough, I think is stronger than at the death after Stalin's death. This so-called Politburo is a National Security Council. Well, who is the members? Who are the members? Nobody's, except that it's run by Putin's buddy, second most powerful man in Russia, FSB Colonel General Nikolai Patrushev, compared to whom Putin is an international, liberal internationalist. So Benny, here are the two tendencies here. And remember, I talked about the tons of poison that Putin systematically infused the consciousness of the Russians, making them believe that what he does and that war is all for the greatness of Russia, or because the West is about to destroy Russia. So what we're seeing here with Putin leaving the stage, I think we will have this the clash of several tendencies here. I'm not terribly optimistic in the short term.
By the way, people, anyone who thinks that learning history is not important, you just got an absolute masterclass in why understanding history is important to understand making policy today. All right, we've got 9 minutes and a whole ton of questions. Let's do a rocket docket if we can. Fred, is it possible for Ukraine to still win? Talking about, is it important they take back some territory? And let me just add in there and vulgarize a very eloquently written question from one of our audience as well. Why does NATO suck? Why haven't we come together more quickly? What's wrong with the Europeans? They're actually on the front lines. Go.
Okay. Yes, Ukraine can win. History is full of examples of smaller states defeating larger states. If size were always the dispositive factor, Frederick the Great would have been crushed very, very quickly, to say nothing of Israel. But you don't need to be the Israelis in order to defeat a larger state. So size is not, in fact, dispositive. Ukraine has a number of advantages in the interest of moving rapidly. I'm not going to list all of them, but they come down to the innovation of its people, its ability to decentralize and allow people to do their thing, which is just antithetical to the Russian way of thinking and operating, and more as Putin confuses himself with Stalin. So the Ukrainians have advantages, and they absolutely take advantage of them. And they also can, in principle, especially if we will step up, draw on the resources of the collective West, which are literal orders of magnitude larger than the resources that Russia can draw on. I mean, just put very crudely, the combined GDPs of the US and the European Union are about $40 trillion. The Russian pre-war GDP was about $1.4 trillion. Do the math. The Ukrainians, if we help them, absolutely can defeat the Russians and push them back. Can they regain all their territory? Not 100% sure about that. But there are strategically vital areas, and we've written about this with my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of War, about exactly which territories are important for which reasons. But the bottom line is that, yes, they do need to regain the territories that they were fighting for in 2023. And they can if they're properly supported. As for the Europeans sucking, actually, at this point, we're the ones who are sucking. European overall pledges exceed American support thus far, even if you count in the bill that's now stalled in Congress. The Europeans are racing to get Ukraine ammunition. We're not giving the Ukrainians anything. The Ukrainians are racing to get Ukraine air defense. We're not giving them anything. This is going on. Europe has woken up. Europe has realized the danger. Europe has realized the importance of mobilizing itself. European countries are making decisions about rebuilding their own militaries to deal with the Russian threat that they know will persist especially if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, and they're racing to help Ukraine. We're the ones who are now standing on the sidelines saying, we don't really think that we should be involved in this anymore. It's way past time to talk about how the Europeans need to step up. We're the ones who need to step up at this point.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Fred. Leon, one of the things that, again, is often absent from this strategic conversation, the strategic imperatives that we see here, pardon me, is that Russia has, during the course of this Ukraine war, rebuilt in some senses forgive me folks, it's too easy to call it this, so I just do, a new axis of evil, right? We've got the North Koreans supplying important elements of weaponry and ammunition to the Russians. We've got the Iranians doing the same. We've got the Chinese again in this new love affair between Xi and Putin. How dangerous is this axis, and is there a risk, and I'm taking one of our audience's questions here and rephrasing it slightly, how big a risk is it that Russia uses this important new axis and starts to take it to the West, take it to NATO, take it to our Asian allies, take it to us?
Danny, yes, there are Iranian drones that are vital. There are short-range ballistic missiles. And the Soviet-made, left from the Korean War, artillery shells from North Korea. It helps. I don't think it's decisive. If all those things that Fred talked about, if the West truly mobilizes, or to use Maggie Thatcher's, does not go wobbly, then that's important, but that's temporary. Now, taking it to the West. If you remember 5 years ago, for which I'm very grateful, you approved a proposal for a little book at that time called A Little Victorious War. And it was about Russia's attacking a small, vulnerable country, NATO member on the eastern flank. We were poo-pooed. I was called a warmonger. Suddenly, it's becoming an issue. Why? Because I always felt that this would be a Hail Mary for Putin. If he is stuck in Ukraine, in the war that he cannot politically lose, for the reasons I mentioned, he cannot politically lose it for domestic political imperatives, then I think he might take it to NATO. And Fred and I had arguments about that. And he may take it. It's called escalate to de-escalate. He may escalate it and put essentially the world on the brink of a nuclear war, and then step back and say, oh, no, we need a comprehensive solution here. Let's decide on the peace in Ukraine, and let's have a peace here. So I believe it's possible. The current wisdom now is 3 to 5 years. I think it will happen next year if Ukraine continues to hold the line.
That's troubling. Fred, what do you see as the prospects for Putin adventuring towards NATO?
I'm going to trouble you more. Could happen faster than that. And without getting into an argument about Leon's scenario, I want to say, actually, I think the likeliest expansion of Russian aggression is as a result of Putin's confidence in his victory in this war. Because the objective is not simply Ukraine. The objective explicitly is the restoration of the empires ruled by Kievan Rus, by the Russian Empire, by the Soviet Union, a long list of other historical states that amount to most of Eastern Europe. And we're already seeing Putin setting conditions for hybrid warfare operations in the Baltic states and Finland, using the exact same playbook that he used to justify the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then again in 2022. He's already doing that right now, and that's moving forward very rapidly. And at the same time, we have activities going on in Moldova, which are too complicated to get into right now, but which suggest that Russian proxies there could move rapidly to try to blow up Moldova. This is coming. This is coming regardless of the outcome in Ukraine. And this is what we need to understand. I disagree with Leon that the scenario whereby Putin expands the aggression is the scenario where he's defeated in Ukraine. he seeks to expand aggression regardless, because he seeks to regain the Soviet Union's dominant role in the world, and particularly in the areas the Soviet Union used to control. Our question is, do we want to allow him to do that, having subjugated Ukraine, having incorporated Ukraine's resources and people into his war machine, which he's working actively to do already? Or do we want to have him impaled on a huge problem in Ukraine, having been defeated, and then trying to do this from a position of weakness? Those are our choices. I think the second one is clearly more advantageous.
We only gave ourselves 45 minutes for this conversation and for the terrific questions that we were getting from our audience, and we've run out of time. First of all, I actually don't think you two disagree that much about this. I think the bottom line here is that you both agree that Putin retains the opportunity to, almost at a time of his choosing, threaten us and our allies in ways that could be extraordinarily dangerous. First of all, let me send everybody in the direction of both of your work. Leon referred to some of his, Fred referred to some of his. This all can be found on our website. If you can't find it, don't hesitate to email me or Clara and ask for it. I will send it to you. Of course, the work of the Institute for the Study of War that Fred works with and Critical Threats works with very closely has all of the strategic information anybody can want. And we had one last question, which I'm not going to give us time to answer, but has the momentum changed between Ukraine and Russia? We had a great conversation on our podcast with Yaro Trofimov about that and his new book. And I commend that to our listeners as well. That's on our What the Hell is Going On podcast. With that, thank you both. I could sit here and talk to you for hours, and I'm pretty sure our audience feels the same way. Thank you for the fine work that you're doing, and we will see you both soon.